A reckless HOA Karen trespassed into my dad's private garage to snoop. She instantly froze in terror when he casually walked out wearing a judge's robe. The morning air was still and cold, thick with that eerie silence that hangs over a neighborhood before sunrise. Dew clung to the grass like glass beads, and a thin mist rolled between the neatly aligned driveways of Lakeside Haven, a place that was supposed to be peaceful, but had long since lost that promise. Mark Rivers stood outside his family's two-story brick home, rubbing sleep from his eyes when he heard the metallic clatter of the garage door rolling up. The noise shattered the calm, echoing sharply through the cul-de-sac. At first, he thought it was his father stepping out early for work, but as the door lifted higher, a shadowy figure in a navy blazer and polished shoes came striding into view. Mark's heart sank the instant he saw who it was. Gregory Kane, the president of the Lakeside Haven Homeowners Association, stood proudly in the driveway, clipboard in hand, eyes gleaming like a predator who had just found his prey. His silver hair caught the first rays of sunlight, giving him an almost regal look, though his presence felt more like a storm cloud rolling in. Without so much as a knock or a greeting, Gregory walked straight into the open garage. "This property is a disgrace," he muttered, his tone laced with superiority. He began snapping photos with his phone, circling the garage like a man inspecting a crime scene. The camera's flash illuminated shelves lined with tools, a few half-used paint cans, and an old wooden workbench. To anyone else, it looked like a typical garage, but to Gregory Kane, it was apparently a violation of community order. "This clutter violates community standards," Gregory announced loudly, tapping his clipboard as though his words carried the weight of law. Mark's pulse quickened. "Mr. Kane," he said sharply, stepping forward, "you can't just walk into someone's property without permission." His voice trembled with restrained anger, but he held himself together. His father had always taught him that composure was stronger than rage. Gregory didn't even glance his way. "As president of the HOA, I have the authority to inspect any property in this neighborhood. This garage, Mr. Rivers, is non-compliant." Mark clenched his fists, the veins in his forearms tightening. The man's arrogance was infuriating. The way he spoke, the way he strutted, like the entire neighborhood was his kingdom. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, reminding him, "Don't let emotion blind your judgment." And then, just as Mark opened his mouth to argue, a soft creak came from deeper inside the garage. The echo of measured footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Gregory paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing toward the sound. A shadow moved behind the rows of shelves, and then, from the dimness, a figure emerged. It was Daniel Rivers, Mark's father. He stepped into the morning light wearing a long black judge's robe, the fabric flowing slightly as the breeze drifted through the open garage. In one hand, he held a steaming mug of coffee. In the other, a folded newspaper. His expression was calm, almost too calm, the kind of composure that only comes from years of sitting on a courtroom bench, weighing guilt and innocence. Gregory's smirk faltered. "Judge Rivers?" he stammered, lowering his clipboard just slightly. Daniel took a slow sip from his mug, his eyes never leaving Gregory's. "Mr. Kane," he said evenly, his voice smooth and measured, "is there a reason you're trespassing on my property this early in the morning?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Mark could see Gregory's confidence crumble bit by bit. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The man who loved to quote HOA bylaws suddenly looked like a student caught cheating on an exam. I was conducting a compliance inspection," Gregory finally muttered, his tone now uncertain. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Without notice? Without consent, on private property?" He took another sip, letting the question hang in the air. "You do realize that's a criminal offense, don't you?" Gregory's jaw twitched. "I was only doing my duty as HOA president," he said, trying to recover his tone of authority. But it sounded weaker now, hollow even. Mark crossed his arms. "Your duty doesn't include breaking into people's garages." Gregory stepped back, his shoes scraping against the concrete. "You can file a complaint if you wish," he said quickly, though his hands trembled slightly around the clipboard. "But understand this, Judge Rivers. No one is above HOA regulations." Daniel smiled faintly, a calm that was almost unsettling. "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Kane," he said softly, "no one is above the law either." The words hung heavy in the cold air, and something shifted in Gregory's expression, a flicker of unease that betrayed his arrogance. For the first time, he seemed to realize he had walked into something far larger than an ordinary homeowner dispute. Mark watched closely as his father stepped closer, his presence commanding, almost judicial. "Tell me," Daniel continued, his tone polite yet sharp as a blade, "did you enter any other homes today without permission?" Gregory's face flushed. "Of course not," he snapped. "Only this one." "I had reason to believe—" "That this property was in violation of what?" Daniel interrupted. "Cleanliness? Order? Or perhaps your personal sense of control?" Mark couldn't help the faint grin tugging at his lips. His father's words cut with surgical precision. Gregory, for once, had no comeback. He looked around, as if hoping a neighbor might appear to back him up, but the street remained empty. Only the three of them standing there, the morning sun slowly breaking through the mist. Daniel finally set his mug on the workbench. "I think we'll end this inspection here, Mr. Kane. I have a feeling this little visit will make for an interesting conversation at the next HOA meeting." Gregory swallowed hard, muttering something under his breath before turning on his heel. His polished shoes clicked against the driveway as he walked away, the false confidence in his stride fading with every step. As the garage door began to lower behind him, Mark looked at his father. "You handled that perfectly," he said, admiration clear in his tone. Daniel picked up his mug again and gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to deal with arrogance is to let it reveal itself." He took another slow sip of coffee, eyes still fixed on Gregory's retreating figure. "Something tells me," he added quietly, "that man hasn't learned his lesson yet." Mark frowned. "You think he'll come back?" "Oh, he will," Daniel said, turning back into the garage. "But next time he won't walk away so easily." Outside, Gregory paused at the edge of the driveway, looking back for a moment before disappearing around the corner. His face was pale, but behind his unease, there was a spark of something darker. Defiance, maybe even revenge. Mark stood there a moment longer, watching the mist roll across the lawns, realizing this wasn't over. This was only the beginning of something much bigger. A battle between arrogance and justice, between power and principle. As the garage door closed with a heavy thud, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the next time that door opened, everything would change. Rain had fallen the night before, leaving the streets of Lakeside Haven slick and glistening under the morning sun. The neighborhood was picture-perfect. Neat hedges, pastel-painted homes, and identical white fences that stretched endlessly like a painted illusion of order. But beneath that polished surface, tension simmered like a hidden fire. Every crack in the sidewalk, every overgrown branch, every misplaced trash bin could trigger a fine. And at the center of that suffocating control stood one man, Gregory Kane. Gregory wasn't just an HOA president. He was a self-made tyrant in a blazer, a man who believed his clipboard gave him divine authority. Standing tall with silver hair combed back and a permanent smirk, he carried himself like a ruler inspecting his territory. From his large glass-windowed office inside his home, he watched the neighborhood through binoculars, jotting notes into a small black journal he never let out of his sight. Every homeowner knew that if Gregory Kane stopped in front of your house, trouble would soon follow. It had started small. Little things, almost laughable at first. Fines for trash cans left out too visibly. Notices for lawns being too dry. One homeowner even received a written warning for hanging wind chimes that Gregory deemed distracting. The residents of Lakeside Haven whispered about him in hushed tones, careful never to say his name too loudly. A few tried to push back, but they soon found their mailboxes filled with new violation letters, or their HOA dues mysteriously increased. Daniel Rivers had tried to stay out of it. As a judge, he was used to people in positions of power and abuse of it. When Gregory first became president 2 years ago, Daniel even hoped the man might improve the community. But what followed was a slow tightening of control. Gregory introduced maintenance inspections, which were really just excuses to pry into people's private spaces. He established a neighborhood watch, which functioned more like a surveillance network loyal only to him. Mark had seen the toll it took on his father. Every week, another envelope appeared in their mailbox, bold letters stamped with the HOA insignia. Violation notice. Immediate action required. Sometimes it was about the color of the driveway. Other times, the placement of their flower pots. It didn't matter that the Rivers home was immaculate. Gregory's goal wasn't compliance. It was dominance. "Dad, why don't you just ignore him?" Mark asked one afternoon, handing his father the latest envelope. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, adjusting his reading glasses. He opened the letter carefully, his expression calm but unreadable. "Ignoring corruption," he said quietly, "only encourages it to grow." He set the paper down and leaned back in his chair. Men like Gregory Kane feed on silence. They mistake restraint for fear. Mark frowned. "Then what do we do?" Daniel looked out the window at Gregory's home across the street, a pristine white house with trimmed hedges and a flagpole in the yard. The man's silhouette was visible behind the curtains, holding those same binoculars. "We wait," Daniel said simply. "People like him always make a mistake. When he does, we'll be ready." But Gregory wasn't planning to stop. Weeks later, he announced a new policy that allowed him to perform random property inspections for community safety. Residents grumbled but complied, too intimidated to refuse. That was when he crossed the line, showing up at the Rivers home once again, claiming he needed to verify structural stability. Daniel wasn't home that day, but Mark was. When Mark answered the door, Gregory stood there with two of his HOA assistants, both holding cameras and measuring tapes. "This will only take a moment," Gregory said, already stepping past the threshold. "You don't have permission to enter," Mark warned, blocking his path. Gregory chuckled, the sound hollow and patronizing. "Permission isn't required when safety's at stake," he replied. "I have a responsibility to this community." Mark's jaw tightened. "You're not the police, Mr. Kane." Gregory's smile faltered for a split second, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "I'll remember that attitude," he said coldly before retreating down the steps. "You're walking a fine line, young man. And when I find what's wrong with this property, and I will, you'll wish you'd been more cooperative." That night, Daniel came home to find a new violation letter waiting on the porch, this one accusing him of unsafe electrical wiring in the garage. It was absurd, but Daniel said nothing. He merely placed the letter on his desk and began jotting notes into his own folder, one labeled HOA Conduct Documentation. Mark didn't understand it then, but his father was already building something, a quiet, strategic counteroffensive. While Gregory believed he held the power, Daniel was cataloging every rule broken, every privacy violation, every falsified claim. Meanwhile, Gregory's obsession grew. He began attending every minor dispute in the neighborhood personally, inserting himself into arguments about parking, mailbox heights, and even pet noise. The residents started calling him the watchdog, though never to his face. He patrolled at odd hours, sometimes seen walking the streets at midnight with a flashlight, muttering to himself about standards. Then came the twist no one saw coming. An anonymous complaint appeared in the HOA records, claiming Daniel Rivers was harboring hazardous materials in his garage. Gregory wasted no time. He announced an emergency inspection, sending a letter that demanded access to the Rivers property within 72 hours. The community whispered nervously. Everyone knew this was personal. Mark watched as his father read the letter. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes, calm and steady, told a different story. He placed the paper down, folded his hands, and said, "So it's begun." Gregory believed he was closing in on victory. What he didn't realize was that he was being watched too. Mark had quietly installed a small camera above their front door after the last incident, one that recorded every move Gregory made whenever he stepped foot on their property. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it would soon capture the first of many mistakes that would unravel Gregory Kane's reign. The following evening, Gregory stood at his window once more, binoculars raised, scanning the Rivers home. His lips curled into a smile as he scribbled something into his notebook. He believed he was untouchable, that no law could touch him within the walls of his HOA kingdom. But just across the street, Daniel Rivers sat calmly at his desk, reviewing footage, organizing documents, and making quiet phone calls to contacts that Gregory didn't even know existed. The storm was coming, but not the one Gregory expected. The night began with an eerie silence that felt heavier than usual. The streets of Crestview Lane were dark, still, and unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel something wrong was about to happen. Inside the Rivers house, Mark sat on the couch with his father, Daniel, both of them listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the living room clock. Then, at exactly 9:47 p.m., everything went black. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished completely. The hum stopped. The clock froze mid-tick. Silence swallowed the house whole. Mark glanced at his father. "Dad, what just happened?" Daniel reached for his phone, the glow of the screen casting long shadows on his face. "Power outage," he muttered. "But only here." He walked to the window and peered outside. Across the street, every other house glowed warm and bright. Every porch light, every street lamp, every flickering television. The only house shrouded in darkness was theirs. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You think it's him?" Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't think," he said quietly. "I know." Outside, a pair of figures in reflective security vests moved toward the corner transformer box, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the dark. Daniel recognized one of them. Brent Lawson, Gregory Kane's most loyal follower, and head of the so-called neighborhood security team. "Stay inside," Daniel said firmly, grabbing his jacket. "Lock the door behind me." Mark hesitated. "Dad? Now." The moment Daniel stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a wall. He approached the men calmly, his voice steady but his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Evening, Brent. You want to tell me why my house is the only one without power?" Brent didn't even turn around. "Maintenance, Mr. Rivers," he said flatly. "Temporary. Orders from Mr. Kane himself." Daniel folded his arms. "At 10 o'clock at night?" "Funny. I didn't see any notice from the HOA," Brent shrugged. "You must have missed it." Daniel's gaze drifted toward the nearby houses. Curtains were twitching, neighbors watching, whispering, pretending not to. Gregory Kane's influence stretched far beyond his own lawn. No one dared cross him. Back inside, Mark waited in the dim blue light of a candle. Hours passed. The refrigerator's contents spoiled, the garage alarm tripped, and the temperature dropped until Mark could see his own breath. The silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. By morning, when the power finally returned, the house felt hollow, violated. Daniel made breakfast in silence, but his movements were sharp, deliberate. Something had changed in him overnight. The doorbell rang at 9 a.m. sharp. Gregory Kane stood on the porch, immaculate as always in his tailored gray suit, holding a clipboard and wearing a smug smile. "Morning, Daniel," he said cheerfully. "Rough night?" Daniel met his gaze without blinking. "You could say that." "Well," Gregory continued, pretending to flip through papers, "we noticed your garage lights malfunctioned during the outage. That's a code violation under community guidelines. Improper property maintenance. I'll have to issue a fine." He handed Daniel the paper, the edge brushing against his palm. "Just doing my job." Daniel took it without looking. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just stared at Gregory's face, memorizing every smirk, every line. Then, to Gregory's surprise, Daniel smiled. "Of course," he said softly. "Rules are rules." Gregory blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Glad we understand each other." He tipped his head and walked off, not realizing that his downfall had just begun. For weeks, Daniel had endured Gregory's bullying. The threats, the fines, the false accusations, all while playing the quiet, obedient neighbor. But beneath that calm surface, he had been planning. Hidden behind the garage vent and beneath the porch light were high-definition cameras he'd installed himself, carefully disguised and synced to an off-site cloud. That night, while Gregory's so-called security team cut the power, the cameras switched to infrared mode, capturing every movement, every face, every unlawful step. Daniel spent the next day reviewing the footage in his home office. The screen flickered, showing Gregory himself entering the garage around 2:17 a.m., flashlight in hand. He rifled through Daniel's tools, inspected the electrical box, and left fingerprints on the handle of the generator. The entire act was recorded, irrefutable proof of trespassing. Mark peeked into the room. "Dad, you got something?" Daniel leaned back, the faintest smile on his lips. "I've got everything." For the first time in months, Mark saw something different in his father's eyes. Not fear, not anger, but control. Daniel wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading. Over the next few days, Daniel quietly gathered more evidence. He recorded every conversation, kept every notice, and built a detailed timeline of every violation Gregory had committed: harassment, falsified fines, and now illegal entry. He didn't tell Mark every detail, only that it was for the right time. But fate had its own timing. 2 nights later, Daniel came home to find tire marks in front of his garage and the side gate slightly open. Someone had been there again. Only this time, the cameras showed something different. Gregory wasn't alone. He was with 2 of the board members, whispering about getting rid of that man before he causes trouble. That was the turning point. Daniel realized this wasn't just about power or pride. It was about control. Control over fear, over silence, over the narrative. And Gregory had crossed the line. Daniel didn't confront him immediately. He waited, patient as a hunter, while Gregory grew bolder. Each visit, each insult, each falsified report only strengthened Daniel's case. When the next HOA meeting arrived, Daniel walked in quietly, carrying a black folder under his arm. Gregory smirked from the front row, surrounded by his supporters. "Daniel Rivers," he said mockingly. "Didn't expect you to show your face here after last week's maintenance issue." Daniel took a slow breath, then looked him dead in the eye. "I came to return the favor," he said. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Photos, screenshots, video stills of Gregory entering his property at night. Gasps rippled through the room. Board members leaned forward, whispering frantically. Gregory's confident grin faltered. "This," Daniel said evenly, "is you on my property at 2:17 a.m. the night the power went out." Gregory's hand trembled. "That's ridiculous." "Fabricated." "Funny," Daniel replied, "because the footage is time-stamped and stored in 3 separate cloud servers. I've already shared copies with law enforcement." The room went silent. Gregory's eyes darted around, searching for support that wasn't there. For the first time, he looked small, cornered. Daniel leaned closer, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You should have known, Gregory. Power built on fear doesn't last. It only exposes who you really are." That night, Gregory drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The image of himself on that screen replayed in his mind like a curse he couldn't erase. Meanwhile, Daniel sat on his porch with Mark, watching the streetlights flicker back to life. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, freer. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. The game had changed. The man who once felt untouchable was about to learn that power built on arrogance always collapses. The days following the confrontation at the HOA meeting passed with deceptive calm. On the surface, Crestview Lane returned to its usual rhythm: trimmed hedges, freshly painted fences, and neighbors offering polite smiles that hid deep-seated fear. Gregory Kane, still clinging to the illusion of power, strutted around the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch. Clipboard in hand, he handed out citations for improper lawn length, unapproved window tints, and parking violations. He believed his reputation had survived Daniel Rivers' challenge. What he didn't know was that every move he made, every letter he sent, every fine he issued was being recorded, not just by a homeowner, but by a man who knew the law far better than he ever could. Inside the Rivers home, the quiet hum of the printer filled the study. Files stacked neatly across the desk, labeled and color-coded with meticulous precision. Daniel sat at his desk, glasses low on his nose, eyes scanning through pages of Gregory's fabricated reports. Mark sat beside him, typing out notes from witness statements. The atmosphere felt less like a family home and more like a war room, calm, organized, but charged with quiet intensity. "Dad," Mark said, looking up from the laptop, Mrs. Alvarez said she still has the notice Gregory gave her about the illegal tree height. Should I ask her to sign the statement? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, and make sure she dates it. Every signature counts. Mark scribbled the note in the margin. It's crazy how many people he's done this to. Daniel's gaze lingered on a photograph of Gregory taken at the last HOA gathering, smiling broadly under a banner that read, "Excellence in Leadership." His voice was calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. Power makes some men blind. They forget that everything leaves a paper trail. Mark leaned back, rubbing his temples. Do you really think they'll listen? He's been running this place for years. Everyone's scared of him. Daniel smiled faintly, though his eyes were sharp with resolve. That's why we don't shout, Mark. We show. Evidence speaks louder than noise. For weeks, they worked in silence. Mark visited neighbors, recording quiet testimonies in their kitchens and porches, stories of fines without cause, threats made behind closed doors, and mysterious deductions from HOA accounts. Each interview added another piece to the puzzle. One afternoon, while sorting receipts from the HOA's expense reports, Mark froze. Dad, look at this. He held up a bank statement showing large transfers labeled as maintenance fees sent to a company called Brightview Consulting. Daniel adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. Brightview Consulting? He typed the name into his laptop. Within seconds, his expression hardened. No business license. No records. It's a shell company, owned by Gregory Kane, Mark muttered, scrolling through the attached documents. The discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about abuse of authority anymore. It was embezzlement. Gregory had been siphoning HOA funds into his own pocket for months, maybe years, hiding behind the same rules he used to punish others. Daniel leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. This is what we needed. That night, he began drafting something far more powerful than a complaint, a legal motion. The pages filled with precise language, citations of property law, and formal requests to the district court. It wasn't just a case against Gregory Kane. It was a motion to dissolve the entire HOA board and trigger a state-level audit. But Daniel didn't act immediately. He knew timing was everything. He waited for the moment when Gregory's confidence would be highest, and his guard lowest. That moment came sooner than expected. A notice arrived in every mailbox announcing the annual HOA General Meeting. Gregory's smiling face adorned the top of the flyer. The agenda: leadership achievements, future plans, and community recognition awards. Mark looked at it and scoffed. He's really planning to brag after all this? Daniel's calm reply came as he folded the notice neatly. Yes, and that's exactly what we want him to do. The night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with uneasy chatter. Rows of chairs filled with residents, some loyal to Gregory, others waiting to see if justice would finally find him. Gregory stood at the front, beaming under the fluorescent lights, microphone in hand, his voice echoing through the room. Good evening, everyone, he began, with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. It's been a challenging year, but thanks to our strong leadership. The doors at the back opened. Daniel Rivers entered quietly, dressed in a dark suit that gave him an air of quiet authority. He carried a single leather briefcase. Mark followed closely behind, clutching a folder labeled Evidence. Heads turned. Whispering spread through the room like ripples in water. Gregory hesitated but forced a smile. Ah, Mr. Rivers, glad you could join us. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on our progress this year? Daniel stepped forward slowly. That's exactly why I'm here. He placed the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside were neatly arranged folders, each marked with dates, transactions, and signatures. The soft click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Over the last 6 months, Daniel began, his voice calm but firm, I've documented a series of irregularities within this board, unauthorized expenditures, falsified fines, and most importantly, the misuse of community funds under a company that doesn't exist. Gasps filled the air. Gregory's face drained of color. That's absurd. These accusations. Daniel lifted a sheet from the folder and handed it to one of the board members. Bank statements don't lie. Neither do recorded testimonies. Each transaction is traced directly to an account under your name, Gregory. Would you like to explain that to the residents? Or to the court? The tension in the room thickened. A few people stood up, murmuring angrily. Gregory looked around, desperate for support, but found none. Even his closest allies avoided his gaze. Daniel continued, his tone steady. For months, you've intimidated and humiliated these people. You believed fear could erase accountability, but the law doesn't bow to arrogance. Gregory slammed his fist on the podium. You can't do this. You're just a homeowner. Daniel's eyes narrowed. No, Gregory. I'm a senior district court judge. And as of this morning, a motion has been filed to suspend this HOA board pending investigation. The words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted in disbelief and whispers. Gregory's knees seemed to weaken. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His empire, built on manipulation and greed, was collapsing in front of everyone. Mark watched as his father closed the briefcase with quiet finality. For the first time, Gregory looked truly defeated, not by shouting or vengeance, but by the steady, unshakable weight of justice. The meeting ended in chaos, residents rushing to read the documents Daniel had left on the table. Cameras flashed as local reporters, tipped off anonymously, entered the hall. Gregory tried to slip out through the side door, but Daniel's voice stopped him. Running won't help you, Gregory, he said calmly. Not this time. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the echo of confrontation faded, Daniel and Mark walked home under the cool glow of the streetlights. The battle wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, Crestview Lane felt like it belonged to its residents again, not to a tyrant. Little did Gregory know that night would become the end of his reign and the start of his humiliation. The Lakeside Haven clubhouse had never been this full. The polished wooden floors gleamed under the chandeliers, and every seat was taken. Neighbors whispered nervously to one another, unsure why tonight's special meeting had drawn such a crowd. Gregory Kane stood proudly at the front of the room, straightening his navy blazer and tapping the microphone twice to quiet the murmurs. Behind him, the Lakeside Haven banner hung like a royal crest, a symbol of the control he had maintained over the neighborhood for far too long. Good evening, everyone, Gregory began, his voice smooth and confident. I'm proud to say our community continues to thrive under strong leadership. Together, we've maintained order, structure, and discipline, the very foundation of Lakeside Haven. A few hesitant claps echoed through the room. Gregory smiled, pleased with himself. He continued, pacing slowly as he spoke. Now, I know some of you have had disagreements with certain policies. But leadership isn't about popularity. It's about doing what's necessary for the greater good. At that moment, the air shifted. The lights flickered once, then again, before the room went completely dark. Gasps filled the air. A few people muttered nervously, and Gregory frowned, looking toward the booth where the projector operator sat. Who's in charge of the lights? This is unacceptable, he barked. Then, the large screen behind him flickered to life. White light illuminated Gregory's stunned face as the projector whirred loudly. The first image appeared, a paused video frame of Gregory himself, standing inside a familiar garage. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Gregory froze. Turn that off, he snapped. But no one moved. The video began to play. The timestamp in the corner matched the night of the supposed maintenance outage on screen. Gregory was seen trespassing into the river's property, snapping photos of the workbench and tools. Then came the damning moment, him instructing one of his security volunteers to cut the main line. The footage showed him smirking as the lights inside the house went out. The audience erupted. Some gasped in disbelief. Others whispered angrily. Gregory's jaw tightened, his voice shaking. This is fabricated. It's been edited. Before he could say another word, the footage changed again, this time showing scanned documents and financial ledgers projected onto the screen. Each page displayed bank transactions linking HOA funds to Brightview Consulting, the shell company Daniel and Mark had uncovered. Gasps turned into outrage. A man stood from the back row. That's where our repair money went, another shouted. Gregory raised his hands defensively. Now, hold on. These are private administrative records. You don't have the right to... But the interruption came from the side of the room. The door opened quietly, and in walked Daniel Rivers, his calm presence immediately silencing the chaos. He wasn't dressed like a resident this time. He wore his full black judge's robe, a sight that carried the weight of the law itself. Every head turned as he made his way to the front, his footsteps measured and deliberate. "Mr. Kane," Daniel said firmly, his deep voice echoing through the hall, "you are under investigation for fraud, trespassing, and abuse of authority." The words landed like thunder. Gregory took a step back, his face pale and glistening with sweat. His clipboard slipped from his trembling hands and clattered against the floor. "This is absurd," he muttered, trying to regain composure. "You can't accuse me of crimes in front of the entire neighborhood." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "I don't have to accuse you, Mr. Kane. The evidence speaks for itself." He gestured toward the screen, which now displayed a series of witness statements, signed and dated, from neighbors who had been unfairly fined or threatened. Each statement appeared like another nail in Gregory's coffin. His loyal board members seated nearby began exchanging nervous looks. A few stood up quietly and slipped toward the exit, unwilling to be seen on his side any longer. The tension in the room grew unbearable. A neighbor from the front row, an elderly man with shaking hands, rose to his feet. "You fined me $400 for having a cracked driveway," he said bitterly. "Then you told me if I didn't pay, you'd put a lien on my home." Another voice joined in. "You cut off our water last summer and said it was our fault." Soon, the entire room was filled with voices, people Gregory had silenced for years finally speaking out. The once proud HOA president stood alone under the harsh glow of the projector, his empire crumbling before his eyes. Gregory turned desperately toward Daniel. "You think you can ruin me? You think your little display will scare me?" His voice cracked mid-sentence. "You have no authority here." Daniel took one slow step closer. "Actually," he said calmly, "I have all the authority I need." He opened a leather folder and held up a stamped document. "This is a court order, issued earlier today. The state attorney's office has approved a full investigation into your financial dealings and conduct as HOA president. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your position pending trial." The room erupted in cheers and disbelief. Cameras flashed as several residents recorded the moment on their phones. Gregory looked around helplessly, his voice lost beneath the roar of the crowd. Two uniformed officers entered quietly from the back, their presence sealing his fate. "Mr. Kane," one officer said, stepping forward, "please come with us." Gregory stumbled as they took his arms. "This isn't over," he shouted, though his voice trembled. "You'll regret this, Rivers." Daniel stood silently as they led him away. The doors closed, and a heavy stillness settled over the room. For the first time in years, Lakeside Haven was quiet, not from fear, but from relief. Within days, news of Gregory's arrest spread through the county. Local newspapers ran headlines about the scandal. HOA president arrested for fraud and abuse of power. Investigators uncovered more misused funds, personal purchases made from community accounts, and records of intimidation stretching back years. Gregory's assets were seized, and he was ordered to repay every homeowner he had wronged. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board was dissolved, replaced by a new resident-elected committee that promised transparency and fairness. The tension that had once divided the neighborhood faded, replaced by laughter, shared cookouts, and evening walks that no longer felt like crossing enemy lines. One quiet morning, Mark stood on the front porch, watching his father sip his coffee as sunlight filtered through the oak trees. The old tension that once shadowed Daniel's face was gone, replaced by a calm satisfaction. Mark smiled. "You did it, Dad." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, son. We did it. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it always comes." As the neighborhood kids rode their bikes past the Rivers home and the sound of lawnmowers hummed peacefully in the distance, Lakeside Haven finally felt like what it was always meant to be, a community, not a kingdom. The neighborhood finally felt free again. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of personal privacy, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that disrespect for property can lead to unexpected judicial intervention.